Every year, the 3rd of May is World Press Freedom Day, an initiative by the United Nations to celebrate the fundamental principles of press freedom and to pay tribute to journalists who have died while doing their work. It comes as journalists around the world continue work under the threat of death for doing their jobs. Just this week, 10 were killed in Afghanistan. 2018 is the 25th celebration of the day and is themed Keeping Power in Check, Media Justice and the Rule of Law. But how free is the media around the globe? Our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease is the chairperson of the International Press Corps at the United Nations, and he joins us. Sherwin, before we get into this, I wonder if you've received any well wishes from US President Donald Trump today.
Well, Donald Trump is really very preoccupied with what his legal team is doing as it relates to a Stormy Daniels sex star. He's very concerned and consumed with Robert Mueller, so not too preoccupied with what he has essentially, Francis, as you will well know, has referred to as the enemy of the American people, that being the press. So I don't imagine World Press Freedom Day is high on the priority list of President Donald Trump.
Yeah, and he's been accused of not supporting the press, of creating a different climate. But let's look at the global picture. Only 13% of the world population enjoys a free press, at least we do in South Africa, where the safety of journalists is guaranteed and the intrusion in media affairs is minimal.
Well, Francis, Donald Trump does offer us a segue into a broader discussion on media freedom and what the UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, tells us in their new report called World Trends in Freedom of Expression and Media Developments. It talks about the increase of authoritarianism, of populist nationalist rhetoric in countries around the world, principally countries like the United States, where the space for media freedom is actually closing, even in democracies like the United States. You can cite countries like Turkey, Egypt and China, which the Committee for the Protection of Journalists lists as the highest jailers of journalists anywhere in the world. Figures of 262 journalists were jailed in 2017, and Francis, 80% of those 262 journalists are jailed for reporting on politics. So these are not necessarily people that are in war zones. These are people that are reporting on the day-to-day running of countries, looking at their political leaders. And there's a real concern here at the United Nations that as you see this tendency to implement anti-terrorism laws in countries, states of emergency, you tend to then infringe on this pivotal aspect of flourishing democracies. There's a real concern at the United Nations that if laws are not passed in countries, whether you're talking about gender equality or media freedom and expression, that it begins to erode at the structures of democracy. And so there's a real call here for countries to really look at their media landscape and enact laws that will ensure, because of media freedom, that the sustainable development goals will be achieved, that notions of no one being left behind will be achieved, and media freedom is being seen and certainly spoken of here as fundamental to achieving those goals by 2030.
So how are we doing? I mean, we hear of arrests still in Zimbabwe, but we are not too bad on the rankings, aren't we?
I saw a number a short time ago, the Reporters Without Borders ranking South Africa third in Africa, behind Namibia and Ghana, which is number one. But I think media freedom, Francis, is one pillar of democracy. South Africa also has a very vibrant civil society. It has an independent judiciary. And so those are some of the fundamentals of any democracy that is required to ensure that we see progress in society. And so we're seeing this direct link between what the media can say and the achievement of human rights for all in democracies. And another big element, Francis, that was spoken about here today was this notion of fake news on social media. There's an MIT report, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, that researched spent a decade researching the trend lines on Twitter, and found that 70% of news that is false tends to be retweeted faster than the actual facts, whether it's politics or the like. 70% of political stories that are fake are being retweeted 6 times faster than the real news. So there's a real concern about what is happening online, and a greater responsibility on people like yourselves and myself to really stand our ground, particularly traditional media hubs, to stand our ground on what is happening on social media as it relates to the truth.
Well, Sherwin, you may be alarmed. I'm surprised. We've run a poll tonight, earlier today, saying at SABC Online, is the press free enough? Is it not free? Or are we in South Africa, the press, abusing our freedom? And the majority is leaning towards abuse. So there is a changing perception, and are we taking our responsibility seriously enough?
I think there is an erosion. I think there's certainly a mistrust of traditional media. We saw that particularly as it relates to the election of President Donald Trump in 2016. There is an increasing distrust of traditional media sources. And because people have access to their own online platforms, you see government ministries, you see politicians online, they can essentially create their own narrative and that in many instances, Francis, can undermine truth and fact. And so it's very important for journalists to get back to investigative reporting, to really check with as many sources. You know, the fundamentals of journalism, what we were taught at university, of the inverted pyramid: who, what, when, why, and how. There are fundamentals that you do not take away from journalism, and that will stand the two of us in good stead moving forward.
All right, so Donald Trump may not be wishing you, but I wish you a happy Press Freedom Day, Sherwin, and thank you for the incredible reports, the incredible standards that you keep, and those reports that you sent through from the US. That was Sherwin Bryce-Pease reporting live from New York. We take a short break. I'll be back with more news.